Wherever you're joining us from around the world, welcome. Thank you for being a part of our latest Global Insights webinar, brought to you in collaboration with Quantum Work Advisory, Talent Tech Labs, and Eightfold. I'm Alex Langford, HR Advisory Practice Leader at Quantum Work, and will be your facilitator today. We're sorry to those that tried to join our live event, but unfortunately technology wasn't our friend that day. But we have a great session ahead designed to provide fresh perspectives on the most pressing topics in the talent space. If after listening to this recording you have any questions, then please just reach out. So we're thrilled to be joined by an exceptional panel of industry experts. Beth Rowland, Partner for International at Quantum Work Advisory, Delle Donne, President and Co-founder of Talent Tech Labs, and Teresa Wykes, Senior Director of Talent-Centered Transformation at Eightfold. So let's dive in first with what talent leaders are talking about. So it's event season. We've all been on the road, attending, speaking, and connecting at conferences. So I'd love you to share what's resonating in the market right now. Brian, let's start with you.
Well, thanks, Alex, and thank you, everyone, for joining this call. Yeah, I would say that if we had to sort of recite a state of the world today, as we've heard it over the past several months, I think one of the top banner items is that organizations today are really prioritizing their investments in technology, and they're making a sort of a binary decision that says if you're going to make an investment, it has to drive efficiency and productivity. That's like a given now. There's no money available for people that are going to come in and have sort of nice to have projects. Projects definitely have to be able to identify an ROI right from the get-go. And so that requires a little additional planning on the part of the people that are going to be trying to get these projects lifted up. Industry-wide, we're seeing a pretty significant amount of vendor consolidation, as well as some what we call platformatization of some of the point solutions that have turned into platforms that have expanded horizontally to take over more of the real estate. And so what we're seeing is a lot of HR organizations recognizing they have too many tools in the toolbox. And so there's actually a thinning of the tech stack, or an attempt to thin the tech stack, and a lot of questions about what do we really need to keep and where can we consolidate or just avoid and shrink our spend a little bit. There's absolutely an arms race that's going on amongst the platforms to control the agentic ecosystem. And we'll talk more about that throughout, but it was the dominant conversation at most of the industry events throughout the fall. And so we'll talk about, where agentic is and what that orchestration layer is. So we'll get into that in a little bit. It seems like most of the major initiatives these days, the transformative ones, are all being generated or initiated from the C-suite. It seems like gone are the days where projects bubble up through the rank and file and say, okay, let's go make a pitch for this. And insofar as the transformational activities that are being kicked off are pretty significant in scale, like we're going to be a skills first company, or we want to be AI first, they tend to emanate from the C-suite. And that's well and good because you have commitment, but what we're seeing is kind of a disconnect between the practitioners saying, okay, now how do we do that? And there's a lot of unknown and uncertainty exactly as to how to catch up with that sort of direction that the C-suite is setting out for the organization. We also noticed that there's been a lot of talk and adoption about the generative AI, which has not been in the market that long. It's just about 3+ years now, but a lot of hype about it. But what we're seeing is that it's largely been underappreciated and under-realized in terms of value. And so we're seeing that, people are implementing and spending money on generative AI in the flow of work, but it's been hard to track an absolute ROI back to it. And so that's really an important factor that exists that says, wait a minute, there's some stranded investment. But before the ink is even dry on that initiative, people are jumping onto the the agentic bandwagon. And so, oh my gosh, how are we going to go back and sort of resuscitate what we've already started in the use of generative? So a little bit of practical challenge about where are we onto our agentic strategy? We haven't even capitalized on our generative, which we've deployed. And so we're going to see more about that going on. However, that agentic layer is complex. The generative layer has actually been, quite helpful to the point solutions and to HR apps generally, because it has become a layer, a wrapper around, which is providing much easier access to these tools and hopefully will help drive adoption. And so we're saying that AI is actually the new user experience. And user experience is absolutely a critical must-have in terms of technology investments these days. In terms of up at night issues, we're hearing people really concerned about the unstructured use of generative AI, having it deployed in the wild and not really measuring the effectiveness of those deployments. And then a very high degree of anxiety about the pace of agentic AI coming into the market. Just a little bit of survey data, just quickly, if you could move a slide over, Alex, I'll talk about how the perception has been recorded across the industry in terms of what potential AI actually has. And so this work emanates from a large survey that we ran with Unleash back in about the April timeframe of 2025. And so the question that was asked is, for each HR function, estimate to the best of your ability the tasks that currently are performed by humans, what degree of them can be automated by technology. And then if you look at the bubble chart on the right, we have, along the left-hand side, core HR, down the middle is the talent acquisition, and then the last lighter green is talent management. And what we see is about half of the organizations, about half, believe that between 10 and 40% of HR tasks can be automated, which is a significant number. However, another slice of the data, which is also revealing, is if you really just skew this to the large companies, those that are over 50,000 employees, we actually find out that they're saying that they think 70% of HR can be automated. So very ambitious opportunities here exist to apply automation if done correctly. If we move the slide, we can talk a little bit about how the adoption is going today. And so, what we've seen, and again, this is a survey that was done with Unleash back in the April timeframe. Back then, 85% of organizations have said that they have generative AI or will have it in the year. That's about up until now, until maybe the spring of next year. And that's clearly been manifest and proved out by the companies that have actually demonstrated that they're on it and they're trying to use it. If you talk about agentic, back in April, we asked, and 72% of the organization said that they would have some form of agentic in use in the next 12 months. And this one is one that when we talk to people at the conferences as late as September, October, we're realizing that there's quite a disconnect. And so back in April, there was a lot of ambition that 72% of them would be using agentic, and what we're seeing is actually quite a few less. And if we turn to the last slide, perhaps the telltale of this was indicated in the survey that we did with the conference board members when we asked them to assess their maturity in terms of their HR analytics and workforce planning people being able to deal with agents in the workforce. And we had absolutely zero said that they had any degree of serious maturity, and only 16% said they were on their way to maturity. So that leaves about 84% of companies lacking a strategy. And so at this point in time, perhaps this is the biggest explainer as to why that the adoption that was once anticipated to be much higher for agentic is not yet there. So let me pause it and pass it over to Teresa, because I'm sure there's many other insights that she and Beth can add.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. So I found myself in the room this event season where there were quite a lot of conversations talking about the role of HR. And I think there's some quite interesting and quite different vocabulary being deployed, and I'm sure we're going to cover it in this session. I think there's been a lot more inventiveness and a bit more boldness about what a potential role for HR could look like within the world of AI, and at the same time that perhaps acknowledging that HR might not be very well set up to do that, or even to partner with IT. So I feel there's been a bit more controversy perhaps, and a bit more confidence about some of that conversation. However, definitely people talking about the need for more courage, definitely some interesting voices about new models of leadership, especially on things like hiring for different qualities such as emotional resilience, cognitive ability, cross-functional thinking, people who can actually come in and work across different departments very, very fluently. And then talk about HR very much in terms of this sort of orchestration role, where you are thinking about how you organize workflows and tasks and things like that, determining if you need agentic in the first place. and what's your capacity and your capability to actually do planning work rather than just kind of normal managing leadership work. Secondly, I think the conversation is amplified this year more about workforce planning. I'm not sure that workforce planning as a concept does itself any favors, but I think that people are now beginning to talk about that, probably because they've got their hands on so much more data through the availability of AI. Interesting conversation about this thing called talent philosophy, which I don't think many companies articulate very clearly, but it's really about things like, what do we think of our talent? What do our leadership think of our talent? How much do we care about our talent? Is everybody equal in the workplace? Do we invest in everyone's capability or just the really good ones? How do we define high potential? And I think that's important because it does then force you to organise your entire workforce, including Agentic AI, in a different way. It's very strongly tied to things like brand and culture, but I think it's actually much more fundamental. But yeah, very few companies actually articulate that. And then something I've noticed this year, far more than any other year, and this is particularly in terms of meeting people, there's been quite a lot of movement into HR from non-HR people. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I think it's a good thing. I think things like, broader transformation backgrounds or business operations, and I think that probably plays into the increase in the number of people doing workforce planning, and particularly in workforce planning, you tend to find those people don't come from HR. So those are some of the things that I've been hearing about in the last few months.
Beth, how about you?
Yes, sure. So, I mean, a lot of consistency, I think, between what Brian and Teresa have shared. So completely echo this sentiment around the C-suite being more of the initiators of wanting to drive efficiency and automation, but really wanting to hold the business's feet to the fire, as it were, to say this needs to be tied to legitimate business outcomes. So exactly as just been pointed out, I think we are seeing a real nervousness around the ability to do that, either from those that have been early adopters that perhaps aren't being able to demonstrate that, or actually a genuine question on the how, because this is not about incremental changes, this is seismic change, and people aren't necessarily tooled effectively to be able to do that. So there's a lot of nervousness, I would say, when you talk to people around what they're doing and how they'll do it. And Brian and I, we did a listening tour prior to our last session webinar that we did. And then even just that sort of 6 months later, I think what I'm experiencing is the continuation of that sort of polar situations of those that are somewhat frozen in the current state and unable to move forward, and those that are really powering ahead with, sort of testing, piloting, iterating and learning. I think there's been a naivety around what it genuinely takes to make a success out of this new capability that is AI within the teams. And actually those organizations that have legitimate rigor around good quality data, that understand the end-to-end processes, are the ones that are coming out tops at this point in time. What others are finding is that actually you can't escape the rigor that needs to be done on the foundational pieces to identify where the opportunities are, and they're still sort of stuck in the mud, as it were, with regards to moving that forward. Again, I also echo this sentiment around talent. So what does that mean to an organization? A lot of conversations, even within the HR space, that are feeling, as has just been pointed out, nervous around their ability to innovate. Do they have the right people that will continue to change and iterate, that have agility, that are empowered, in fact, to go forward and take chances and make mistakes and then keep going? There's a lot of fatigue out there at the moment because the demands and the expectations from the business to make those efficiencies are high. And then, yes, exactly as Teresa said as well, just to pull on that final point around the movement of talent into HR from other areas. I've definitely been talking to a number of people that have gone from technology into HR, and actually the converse of that. So started in HR and moved into technology. And these are the connectors, I think. These are the ones that can speak on both sides of the fence to make sure that they are working in that collaborative way. And those are the ones that we're genuinely seeing success from as well. So yes, just an awful lot of the same. The one thing that I will say, again, to Brian's point earlier, is where we have seen this convergence of technologies, the theme of nervousness continues to come forward when we're working with clients. So we're finding decisions have been made around their tech stack, and now they're going back and they're re-reviewing them. Is this still the right decision for us? Should we be waiting to see what our core HR system is going to come out with next? And actually further interrogation around commitments and promises for future roadmaps with technology that they've made commitments to. Will they legitimately be realized in the time frame that's going to work for that client? So we're finding ourselves doing a whole host of work in what we call phase 0, which is around what's the current state, what is it you're trying to solve for, and how do we stress test the decisions then that they're making moving forward to make sure that they have some level of longevity. And just on the point of longevity, it's quite an interesting time as well. We always spend our time with business leaders talking about 3 to 5 year plans. That is shrinking down significantly. People are saying, I cannot predict what's going to be going on in 3 to 5 years. At best, Mr. or Mrs. Business Leader, I will give you 12 to 18 months and then we'll review it again. So that's the sort of speed with which things are happening.
Perfect. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, everyone. So let's kind of build on the theme of AI and agentic technologies. It was a consistent theme that you all talked about. So since our last webinar in April, how have things progressed? What shifts are we seeing in vendor capabilities, and where are organizations finding success or facing challenges? Teresa, let's start with you.
Okay. So I can talk a bit about what I've been hearing, and then I can talk a bit about, specifically what we're noticing with some of our customers and prospects. So I think in terms of what's happening in the wider world, we're definitely beyond the hype now. So the conversations are going right through to things like career coach agents, performance review agents, management agents. That's certainly, where we're heading for at Eightfold. We're also seeing lots of actual demos and case studies now. So people are now able to tell a story, able to talk about success. And some of the demos are quite exciting. The conversation again about how it's changing HR and how it's changing workflows. We've already talked about that a bit. I think as well there's more confidence about talking about the distinction between perhaps sort of exciting automation type stuff and then genuine AI driven transformation. I think I heard a few speakers talking about true value lying not just in task automation, but in reshaping behaviors and workflows. So, you're urging leaders to focus on changing habits and organizational culture and not just investing in tools. So that much more rounded conversation is happening. As Beth was saying, though, adoption is accelerating, but companies are still in quite an early phase. Most deployments are proofs of concept, and there's a shared recognition that big productivity gains are going to need a lot more deep embedded, proper behavioral and process changes rather than just, looking at it as a technology rollout. I also think that there's a willingness now to sort of remember actually in with agentic particularly, you've got to get back to the basics. You've got to actually look at your management technique, working with agents being like a good manager. You've got to define roles crisply. You've got to put guardrails down. You've got to have quality checkups. You've got to make people feel comfortable, that kind of thing. So that's what I'm seeing out there. But then if I think about in terms of how it's working with our own customers, we think it's very important that you've got to sort of talk about the theory and understand the groundwork here. So I think particularly when we're talking to some prospects, they can be quite terrified or quite overwhelmed actually with a conversation about all the things that AI can do, particularly agentic. So what tends to go down well for us is if we set up the credentials first. So how it works, things like the data, the patents, the credibility. So for us, we can talk about things like, how we've been advising public sector bodies, financial services, highly regulated, highly compliant industries. That creates confidence with people before we go in with the more kind of dramatic, wow stuff. I think as well, if you've got a sort of situation with agentic capability, particularly in talent or in recruiting, everyone has those situations where their funnel is massive, they've got too many applications coming in, people sending in multiple applications, all that kind of stuff, fraudulent applications as well. So talking about how it can handle those very worrisome aspects of a workflow really go down well. I think some AI vendors can be quite academic in the way that they talk, and I don't think that's very relatable, particularly when you think that most people are actually quite reluctant or quite scared about this. So particularly for us, it's not just a concept; it's actually happening, and it is fundamentally changing the TA operating model.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. Beth, how about you?
Yeah, so a couple of things, I think, actually. So there's a definite trend from the conversations, and even where we're seeing the roadmap for the various technologies, sort of high level of focus on the TA side as it relates to agentic AI. And I think that makes sense because, as Teresa just said, that's where you're going to see great deals of volume. That's where you can start to use those agents in a way that will help you to bring that down to more manageable, consumable applicants, perhaps. And I think that is a good thing on the one hand. But I think there's a cautionary tale as well, which is don't do that in pure isolation. Make sure that you are engaging the broader management, because again, as Teresa just talked about, I think there is a potential here for missing a trick around getting the culture and the readiness of your organization and the people to start to engage with these agents in a way that sees them as colleagues. So let's stop thinking about them as just being pure technology, but actually capability, part of the capability of your teams. And I worry if it's kept in an isolated piece in the first instance within TA, which I think is probably a great place to pilot, you're going to really struggle with that transition and actually changing the way of thinking, feeling for your employees, your hiring managers, and those that are coming into the organization to be employees. It cannot be underestimated. So, this is going to be a long old journey and a completely different way of operating. So by all means, start in TA, but at the same time, really start making sure that you're thinking about those cultural shifts, that psychological safety of your organization. Otherwise, my fear is it will remain a pilot for forever and a day. And then I think, make sure that you're iterating. That's the next thing I would be inclined to say here. So there is a tendency to think that there will be one and done, and this will not be the case. I think we're going to see many iterations, not only in terms of the advancements of the technology, but in terms of the organizational's willingness, appetite, and capacity to absorb it. So if I think about one of the questions I had at one of the events I was speaking at this year, it was around the ethics of agentic AI and what should we be doing. And my answer to the individual was, you need to be very clear up front about what it is that you want as an organization. Where is your appetite? Where are your boundaries? What's acceptable? As soon as you're working within the parameters of legislation, because just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And just because you can doesn't mean you should right now. So yeah, those are probably just some of the key things that I've seen these past few months.
Perfect. Thank you. Brian.
Well, let me pick up on some of the points that Teresa made when she cited the very specific bots that are taking on sort of unique capabilities, whether it's a scheduling bot or a TA assistant or a career planning bot. And so what keeps me up at night is the not that the bots exist, but the proliferation with which they're coming to market. And so you've got the core providers, the platforms themselves, trying to create automation and agentic capabilities. You've got the large vendors like Eightfolds and others that are building agentic capability into theirs. And then there's a whole host, and Talent Tech Labs just reported on this at the Unleash conference. We had a presentation on the whole bot ecosystem, and there are over 50 companies that just design bots. And so not only now do you have them be coming to life in the infrastructure, which is like the Microsofts or the ServiceNows that you're operating ubiquitously with, but then you have your customized point solution apps that are building capabilities. And then you have bot shops coming to IT departments saying, hey, build your own, you'll get what you need that way. And so it's that proliferation that troubles me the most. And I think that what we've seen in the market now is a bit of a stratification, people coming to recognize that they can't all exist in the same space. There is an arms race to go on and control that ecosystem, that infrastructure, what we call an orchestration layer, but we're actually seeing it stratify. And so in the infrastructure case, you've got like the Microsofts in Teams or other ubiquitous applications like Google, if you're running a Google shop, where you have agent stores and then skills agents, specific agents being built. And those are going to be in the infrastructure and somewhat different, almost generic compared to what you're going to find in HR, either through your HR tech vendor or through a do-it-yourself. But if you look at the large vendors like the enterprise apps, they're in an absolute foot race to try and build out that layer, mostly through acquisition. We see ServiceNow in the past year buying QN.ai, which is an AI automation platform. They bought MoveWorks, which is a conversational AI tool for employee support. They bought DataWorld, which is a data and governance platform that actually presents a searchable knowledge graph around how AI is being used in the organization. Of course, SAP's in the game. They bought, besides Smart Recruiter, they're doing putting Joule in a lot of places, which is their ubiquitous AI agent. And then in Workday's case, they've been pretty aggressive. I mean, they started with acquiring HiredScore. That's a while ago, but it really was the beginning of that kind of orchestration capability. Since then, they bought FlowWise, which is an open source AI agent, which is they're calling it their orchestration engine. Paradox was acquired by them, which gave them conversational AI capability. And then most recently, Sana, which, although it's a learning experience platform, underneath, it's a really wonderful user interface, and they're going to make that their point of entry into their ecosystem for all sorts of agents. And so this is just an indication of how the companies are racing to try and control the space. But it also is good news because it is actually starting to stratify. So buyers can now start to recognize, hey, these things we can rely on an infrastructure solution for. These we want to have reside, at the application layer where you're going to have practitioners may be more responsible for the selection of them and the deployment of them. And we could talk about it a little more, but clearly that is creating the new need for partnerships inside of an organization, that you have the right talent looking at these things, being able to make smart decisions, and then deploying them in a unified fashion. I'll pause there, Alex, and give it back because you can keep the show rolling.
Sounds good. No, thank you, Brian. So let's pivot to what's next. So as organizations are wrapping up the year, planning for 2026, what should be top of mind for talent leaders? Beth, let's start with you.
Yeah, and I guess for me, there's kind of like a bit of a summary of many of the key points that we've discussed so far. So, again, I think this is reflective in the sort of work that we're being asked to partner on. So make sure that you craft your HR-focused AI strategy aligned to the enterprise goals. That's first and foremost. If you want to get the commitment around the investment, then make sure that you can demonstrate legitimate outcomes. Tied to that, I would say, is be very realistic about when you expect to be able to demonstrate the ROI back to the business. I think there's been a naivety about how quickly this will happen, how you'll turn the switch and suddenly you can take 20% of your cost out of your business. That is simply not the case. So be very realistic about that. Make sure when you're looking at the work, if I think about that in the context of your broader people and culture or your talent organization, redesign the roles for AI-enabled processes. So the way that you operated in the past will be different in the future. So make sure that you're thinking about that. And again, I think that even at that sort of micro level within your talent space comes back to the piece that Teresa was talking around with regards to your own workforce strategy. So it will be different. Think about that org design. Focus on high value user cases. So as I said, I've definitely seen a trend around talent acquisition as being sort of a great entry point for these sorts of things, but you need to make sure that you can demonstrate measurable impact. That's how you will iterate. That's how you'll get future investment and confidence from your business that you're on the right track. And then really just that last piece around the readiness, the psychological safety of the people in your organization, upskill them, make sure that you understand the people, the human element of the work that still needs to be done and how that will work in conjunction with AI for the future.
Thanks, Beth. Brian, what about you?
Well, those are great themes, Beth, and I would say that just to maybe put another layer on top of those things, people. I illustrated through that slide sort of the deceleration of all the enthusiasm that existed as early as April of this year to where we are today, where people are realizing that, wait a minute, we're trying to address this without a proper strategy in place. And so there's a real focus going on. And I would encourage leaders to start think about, what have been those barriers to adoption in your own organization? What's it going to take to close those gaps? What we heard coming back in a number of conversations is lack of internal expertise on the team. How are we going to close those gaps? And so that has to do with workforce planning. And as Teresa pointed out, people coming from outside of HR into HR and vice versa. The complexity of the integrations was also probably the second biggest factor that we heard. And so people looking at ways to either stratify that or perhaps simplify it. And then, of course, the concerns about your readiness of your data, because at the core of all this, you have to have pretty clean data to make these systems work. And I think there's a large recognition sort of behind the scenes that our data might not be up to snuff. And so some projects are kicking off to think about sort of that data fidelity before we jump in and make additional investments. But in terms of putting the right person in the right seat on the bus, I think that organizations that are making some progress in this area, and perhaps the pathway to success ultimately will be the formation of partnerships. Again, a little bit about that stratification where the CIO's team is probably going to own the infrastructure decision-making around those tools. That's not an HR decision like to buy Microsoft Teams. But so that kind of infrastructure decision is being made at the CIO's level, while the applications are still being acquired by and thought about and deployed by the practitioner level, and so the HR organization. And so what we see as a viable pathway is the formation of a strong partnership between the CHRO and his or her team with the IT department, and trying to come up with an understanding about how do these systems layer on top of each other. Who's the best person or teams to orchestrate the lead on getting those acquired and making sure that they're understood, and providing a clear framework for then the integration of the applications downstream from that, and ultimately trying to focus on satisfaction of users along the way. And so I think that teaming now between HR and IT is more in demand than ever. And in fact, some of the people that are making the earliest progress are ones where that delineated practice of unification between HR and IT is the indicators of early success.
Completely agree. Teresa, what about you?
I'd just add another little comment to what Brian said about, expanding relationships from HR into IT, which obviously goes without saying. But I would also think about other leadership roles within that. So, for example, I think chiefs of staff are really good to get close to because they tend to be very close to the work as well as the workforce. Anyway, but apart from that, I mean, yeah, exactly what Beth and Brian have been talking about. I think overall, if you're an HR leader, you need to start thinking about rethinking your leadership profile, and that includes how you hire leaders, because I think you'll start hiring for quite different qualities, as well as adapting the leaders that you've got. Because if you're thinking about AI, you're thinking about agentic, you've got to focus on the workflow rather than the agent or even the technology, and treat all those decisions like decisions about the team. Do you need, well, you will need a combination of people and agents and tools, and you should onboard those tools, people, agents in the same way as if they are members of the team. So yeah, I think that a big dose of courage, and also the other thing, I think there's so much content out there at the moment. There's never been so much HR content for obvious reasons. Just keep talking to people outside of your business, get into networking in a big way, even if it makes you feel slightly uncomfortable. I think there's huge value in talking to people outside, and hearing their stories, and building this together, because there aren't really any kind of guidebooks. So yeah, that would be my advice.
Perfect. Thanks, Teresa. So we're coming to the end of the webinar, and before we close, I'd love to invite each of our panelists to share one final thought or takeaway for the audience. Beth, do you want to start?
Oh no, I'm worried I'm going to say something contentious right at the end, but bear with me. So, and again, it goes along the theme. If I think about the conversations I've had most recently, literally in the last 2 weeks, there's a couple of words that became quite contentious, and everyone hated them around the prospect of total talent. It was like, oh, please don't go there. But the truth of the matter is, the conversations that I've just been having in the last few weeks is around workforce planning, is around what skills do we need in the organization now and into the future, is around who and what will do the work. And actually, the conversation that's been coming back as you look at your entire workforce, so that's your extended workforce, your permanents, your gig workers, etc., is now the question around, do I need them permanently? Do I need them temporarily? Do I need these skills into the future? What do I need to retire? And I feel as if this is a conversation that's coming back onto the table. So how do we make sure that we leverage all of this capability in the right way? Now we've got better insights, or we intend to get better insights into that total workforce. So I can see that this is going to be an ongoing conversation with better visibility.
Right. Thank you. Teresa, what about you?
I think after all the stuff I've heard, I think it's really, I think we always thought we had to be able to plan. And I think now it's more just about being prepared. So that's a slightly different stance. It's a slightly different posture. I think in terms of being prepared rather than planning.
That's great. And Brian, finally.
So I love what Beth characterized about the comeback to the extended or the universal workforce, because there's been times when that was heralded as the next step that you need to take. But I think you're exactly right, Beth, that right now there's a recognition that the product life cycles are so short that the fluidity of talent is going to be essential to being successful, and to think about everything in terms of, do I have to hire a full-time person by the time I have them or up to speed, or they're already obsolete. And so, the idea of looking at your workforce in a way that you could more agilely address the dynamics of the market, the capabilities that the vendors are bringing to the space, the demands that the outside world is putting on the business, the better off an organization will be to be able to weather the twists and turns in the business cycles and in the macro changes that are going on. And coming back to a little bit of what Teresa indicated, there certainly is a fear of missing out and anxiety, like, oh my God, are we going to miss this? Or maybe fear of becoming obsolete, FOBO. But, I think that really now is the time. It's okay to pause, to plan. And so as long as that planning is done with an eye towards what you're trying to get at the outcome, at the outset of that, you really need to be putting a governance structure in place. You need to be establishing frameworks that allow for the organization then to marshal through these changes and get them implemented in a way that they're adopted and embraced and actually capitalized on. So, besides the fear of missing out, it is okay to pause for a moment, take a breath, and plan, because that biggest gap, the 86% of folks that don't have a strategy, are going to have to quickly come up with strategies. And so the best way to do that is to think about carefully what it is you need to put in place.
And with that, we're at time. So a heartfelt thank you to our panel, Beth, Brian, Teresa, for sharing your expertise and insights. And we thank you for watching this today. Wishing you all a strong finish to the year and a successful start to 2026. Take care and go well. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Cheers. Bye.